All right. So there are different ways to actually physically do the ratings. Graphic rating scales are among the oldest formats used in any kind of performance evaluation. In this style, you rate a number of traits or behaviors, and the raters judge where the ratees fall within respect to the organization's expectations. So we have, 4 on this rating scale that you see here being set as, okay, this is what we expect. You're below it or you're above it, right? And you can be some degree below it, some degree above it, whatever that is. And so you're used to this. You've probably seen this at school. You've probably seen this in lots of different contexts. So graphic rating scale. So now there's an escalation of that graphic rating scale called the bars system, which is a graphic rating scale, but now we've added behavioral descriptors as anchors. So now it's vertical, so it's a little easier to stick some writing in this thing. And so we've got 1 at the top, meaning you're not doing well. You've got 10 at the bottom being good performance, and 5 or 5.5 is, meeting expectations. All right. So there are little words, little phrases that explain what the different numbers mean. So here we have takes shortcuts around established procedures at every opportunity, isn't very knowledgeable about procedures and doesn't make much of an effort to stick to them, right? Usually follows most important procedures, but occasionally skips step in the process. Very conscientious about following procedures, but skips some procedural steps for tasks that he or she knows fairly well. Never deviates from the procedures outlined for a particular task and takes the time to do things according to the employee manual. Obviously, this scale really values doing the procedure as you were instructed and sticking to the manual. If you do less than that, you're going to be towards the poorer performance. If you do exactly as that, you get the top scores. So this is what we call bars. It's still a graphic rating scale, but now you have like a picture, a description of what each of the numbers means on that scale. So as the rater, you can kind of read what it says and figure out what number you should assign. And so you see that, for example, you've got number 5 being usually follows most important procedures. 6.5 is very conscientious about following procedures. And you're like, I'm going to give him a 6. Sort of in between those two characteristics, whatever. Gives you a little bit more concrete information to make your decision. So just to illustrate why there aren't more of these bars systems out there, I thought I'd share with you how they're developed, because this is the kind of thing that like an IO psychologist would be able to do really easily and well. But a lot of organizations who are making their own rating scales don't want to take the time to do what it takes to make these bar systems. So first thing you have to get is some subject matter experts to identify and define the dimensions of the job. Okay. Then other people, not the subject matter experts, but others are going to generate behavioral examples. So the SMEs identify and define the dimensions. Then you say, hey, person who also works here, now that you see these dimensions, can you give me some behavioral examples of how these dimensions would be illustrated? One thing that they could use is what's called the critical incident technique, which is where they give examples of some incident that has happened in the past, or describe a fictitious incident that might happen in the future. Like that's a really common way that they do that. You sort the critical incidents into dimensions within themselves and retranslate to see if now those critical incidents actually map back to the dimensions of the job as identified and defined by the SMEs. So you have somebody else generate the behavioral examples. Well, now we want to make sure that those behavior examples actually do tie back to the dimensions. So we have to do that retranslation stage. And then you rate behavioral examples on effectiveness. It's taken a while. And then we finally choose those items that we think will be the most helpful or critical for doing our ratings. By the time you got through my 5 stages with 2 sidebars, you probably noticed this is kind of painstaking to go through this process. It takes a lot of time and therefore a lot of money to do this because you're going to take people away from their normal everyday tasks and ask them to spend their time identifying and defining the dimensions of the job, and then other people generating the behavioral examples. And then I don't know who's supposed to sort the critical incidents into dimensions and figure out if it's still, this is a lot for people who it's not their job to be doing this. So this is where IO psychologists can be super helpful, because this is the kind of thing that you can actually do without it interfering with like your real job, because this is your job. So it's a perfect thing to hire an IO psychologist for, is to do this process so you could develop the bars system. It's in some ways worth its while, because now when you have raters rating people, they have something specific to hang their rating on. Whereas with the graphic one, they're just sort of going with their gut. They're like, well, vaguely higher, but a little bit more than a vaguely higher. I'll give them a 7, right? They're just sort of guessing. Whereas with a bars system, they actually have words to hang it on to. So it might be worth the while to pay somebody like an IO psychologist to create this, right? Checklists are another way that you can kind of simplify the rating process. There's what we call a weighted checklist, where you have items that were previously weighted on importance or effectiveness, usually by supervisors or somebody in the organization. You want some items that indicate desirable behaviors, and you want some items that are indicating undesirable behaviors. So as an employee, you would want to receive some high scores and some low scores, ideally high on the desirables and low on the undesirables. But you want to have some of both listed so that you're not only looking for positives, or you're not only looking to criticize. Another way to design a checklist is what we call a forced choice checklist. And this is where you have the raters choose 2 items from a group of 4 that best describe the employee. And the purpose is, now I'm just looking for the 2 things that fit best. It gives me a little flexibility and reduces my tendency for bias or distortion as the rater. The drawback of both of these is that raters don't like having to be stuck to checklists. They don't really like the constraint. They feel like they're not having control over the rating process, so they don't like it as much. The people who are receiving the performance reviews oftentimes don't like it as well either, because it feels like all you did was make check marks, and I need to see a little bit more like context, explanation. Like that bars chart is really nice because it gives you exactly what the rationale is for the number that you got. This doesn't have inherent in it rationale. It just has a bunch of behaviors that are important or not. But they're easy to do because all you have to do is check. So that's a positive, I guess. How about employee comparison procedures? This is where you're going to evaluate the employee in comparison with other employees in that same job category. Oh, this can't go wrong, can it? Who doesn't love to be compared to their peers? This is going to go great. So one thing that you can do is just a strict rank ordering. Decide who in this, let's say, unit of accountants in our department, which one would you say is the number 1 accountant, which one would you say is number 2, and so on down however many accountants you have, right? And just sort of rate them. It could be as vague as what I just did. Of these people, who do I consider number 1? It could be that vague. It shouldn't be. It should be based on specific behavioral things. Like I should be objectively looking at productivity or, leadership or something documentable that I can then hang my hat on for why I'm calling this the number 1 person, because we kind of open ourselves up to discrimination claims if we just sort of go with our gut. We better have some documentation for that. Another thing that we can do is do paired comparisons where let's say we have 10 employees in this unit, and so we give each of them sort of a head-to-head comparison. So employee 1 versus employee 2, employee 1 versus employee 3, and so on all the way till we've done employee 1 against all the way up to number 10. And then you start with employee 2 and start comparing 1 by 1 to everybody else. Might work if you had 10 people in your department, but it probably doesn't work if you're getting much larger than that, because it becomes really complex. It's like n factorial complex. Anybody who knows that number. So it becomes really large really fast. N factorial is where n is whatever number. So let's say we have 10 employees, and then factorial is an exclamation point, is the notation for it. To compute that, you take n, in this case I said it would be 10, times n minus 1 times n minus 2 times n minus 3. So it's like 10 times 9 times 8 times 7 times 6 and so on, down until you get down to 1. That's a lot of numbers if you have 10 people. That's how many different permutations there are if you're pairing every employee pair one by one until you've gone through every matchup that there is. So I'd say 10 is about the most you could probably handle. Forced distribution is when you have maybe people who are roughly equal to each other. You know, the ratings that have been given are basically equivalent, but you have to decide something. Maybe to make a raise or to give a promotion or something like that. You have to break the tie somehow. So we call it a forced distribution. At some schools, they use a forced distribution procedure where everybody's grades are sort of lined up from highest to lowest. And the middle 65% of the scores are called a C. The upper 14% beyond that and the bottom 14% beyond that, that's called the B and the D. And then the top 2% and the bottom 2% are called the A and the F. And that's it. It doesn't matter. Even if a bunch of numbers are very similar or whatever, that's how they do it. That's called a forced distribution. We're going to force you into what appears to be a normal distribution. With employees, we probably don't have enough people to really force a normal distribution no matter what. But the idea is everybody is roughly the same, and we're going to have to figure out some way to separate them out and decide who's moving on and whatever. These kinds of systems are fraught with lawsuits because there's the risk that the force that is used to make a distribution is not fair or isn't job-based or something. I have to say we had a hiring situation once where we had two really good and very equal candidates. And we had 4 people on the hiring committee. Oh, bad idea. It should always be an odd number. Because we had 4 people and 2 of us wanted one of the candidates and 2 of us wanted the other candidate. And we kept voting and we kept making our arguments for why one was better than the other and why we thought this or that. And we'd vote again and we were tied again. And so we flipped a coin 3 times. And the candidate who got 2 out of 3 is the one who was offered the job. Like, that is what we're talking about with a forced distribution that could potentially run into a lawsuit. Because that was not a decision that was based on data and evidence. We were stuck. And so that's hard to defend. That's a hard one to defend. You know what? Luck had it that the person that we hired was outstanding in reality, in actual practice. And the person who we did not would have been a gigantic liability. There were things that we discovered later and that happened in their career later that had that been our choice, that would have been a disaster. So I guess we lucked out. Flipping a coin worked. But probably in your career, you don't want to be flipping coins to make your decisions. That's all I can say. All right, I think this is a good time to stop and we'll come back and talk about the cognitive processing model of performance appraisal in the next video.